Dying Bobcat clutched a book in the rain. The secret inside it will break your heart. The November rain poured down on Oakhurst, bringing the bone-chilling cold of the ancient Yosemite forest. Inside his workshop, 74-year-old craftsman Ellis quietly poured a leftover cup of coffee into a thermos, a habit remaining from the weeks since his cat, Chip, passed away. Suddenly Noma, a stray calico who usually kept her distance, scratched violently at the door, sensing her desperation. Ellis grabbed his flashlight and followed her into the storm toward the old railroad tracks. Under the flickering beam, he saw a wild bobcat collapse by the roadside. Ellis stopped dead, his heart hammering at the sight of the predator. But the animal was not aggressive. Instead, he was shivering violently from exhaustion, his ribs showing clearly beneath a matted, soaked coat. Most remarkably, his forepaws were tightly clutching a water-soaked hardcover book against his skeletal chest. The bobcat's eyes were barely open, just slits of awareness in a face contorted with effort. He was dying, that much was obvious. Yet even in his final moments, he would not let go of the book. Ellis took a cautious step forward. The beam of his flashlight illuminated the scene more clearly. Ellis tried to reach out slowly, but the bobcat hissed feebly. It was a weak sound, holding no real threat, as the animal tightened its grip on the book. Claws dug into the cover, and its body curled protectively around it. The message was clear: the bobcat would rather freeze to death in the mud than let that book go. Realizing he had no other choice, Ellis opened his umbrella to shelter them both. He sat down in the slushy mud, the cold and wet immediately soaking through his clothes. Within minutes, he went numb, but he stayed, holding the umbrella steady to create a small, dry sanctuary. 3 grueling hours passed in the freezing rain. Ellis's legs cramped, his back ached, and the cold worked deep into his bones. He thought of his warm workshop and his bed, but he could not walk away. Something about the animal's absolute refusal to abandon the book kept him rooted to the spot. As time crawled by, the bobcat's shivering grew weaker and its eyes closed completely. Yet its paws never released their hold. Finally, the bobcat's body went slack as it succumbed to hypothermia and drifted into unconsciousness. Only then, when the animal could no longer resist, did Ellis gently pry the book away. It took effort, even unconscious. The bobcat maintained a death grip. Ellis worked with extreme care, afraid of hurting the creature or waking it, before preparing to bring them both to safety. Once the book was free, Ellis wrapped the bobcat in his sheepskin coat. The animal was heavier than he looked, all dense muscle and bone despite his emaciated state. Ellis struggled to lift him. His own body protested every movement after sitting in the cold for so long, but he managed to stand, cradling the bobcat against his chest. Noma trotted ahead through the rain, leading them back to the workshop as if this had been her plan all along. The next morning, Ellis woke stiff and aching in his chair by the fireplace. The bobcat lay on a pile of old blankets, still unconscious but breathing steadily. The fire crackled and popped, filling the room with warmth. Ellis had stayed up most of the night feeding logs into the flames, trying to bring the animal's body temperature back to normal. Now, in the gray light of dawn, he could examine his unexpected guest more carefully. The bobcat was young, maybe 3 or 4 years old. His coat, once dried by the fire, showed the beautiful spotted pattern typical of his species, but he was painfully thin. His left rear leg lay at an odd angle, clearly damaged. Scars crisscrossed his shoulders and flanks. This was an animal who had suffered. Ellis turned his attention to the book. It sat on his work table where he had placed it the night before. The Velveteen Rabbit. Ellis recognized it immediately. He had read this story to his daughter decades ago. The cover was water-damaged, the pages swollen and stuck together. With a master's hands, steady despite his age and the previous night's ordeal, Ellis began the emergency surgery on this precious keepsake. He worked slowly, methodically. Each page had to be carefully separated from the next. If he rushed, the paper would tear. If he pulled too hard, the words would smudge and disappear. He set up drying racks near the fire and began the painstaking process of separating each wet page. As he worked, fragments of the bobcat's life began to emerge from between those pages, hidden beneath the velvet cover. pressed flat by time and water, was a blurred Polaroid photo. Ellis held it up to the light. The image showed a small bobcat, just a cub, nuzzling a snow-white cat through the slats of a wooden fence. Their faces were pressed together tenderly. The white cat's eyes were closed in contentment. The bobcat cub looked utterly peaceful. There was no fear in that image, only love. Ellis felt his throat tighten. He set the photo aside carefully and continued separating pages. On the page where the story discussed the nature of love and becoming real, he found two tufts of fur. One was pure white, silky and fine. The other was spotted brown and coarser. They had been pressed flat together, their fibers intertwined as if they had been deliberately woven. This was not an accident. Someone had placed them there intentionally, a keepsake within a keepsake. Turning to the title page, Ellis squinted through his magnifying glass. Water had blurred some of the ink, but he could still make out the words written there in a child's careful handwriting. Names had been stricken out. Belongs to Alara was crossed out with a single pencil line. Below it, belongs to Quinn was also crossed out in the same manner. And the final line, written in slightly shakier letters as if the writer had been emotional. Read and Grin, Quinn's best friend. Ellis stared at that name. Grin. He looked over at the unconscious bobcat by the fireplace. Is your name Grin? He asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper, for the first time since being brought inside. The bobcat's ear twitched slightly, just a small movement, but unmistakable. The animal had heard. He had recognized his name even in unconsciousness. Ellis knew he could not stop here. The mystery of this book and this bobcat demanded answers. He carefully finished drying and arranging all the pages, then drove into town. The old library was small and quiet. It stood on Main Street between the hardware store and the post office. The elderly librarian, a woman named Margaret, whom Ellis had known for years, looked up from her desk as he entered. When Ellis showed her the book and explained how he had found it clutched in the paws of a dying bobcat, Margaret's face softened with a sudden, painful recognition. She set down her pen, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them on the desk. That book belonged to Alara Vance, she said quietly. A sweet girl, only 10 or 11. She loved to read. Her white cat, Quinn, was killed by falling timber at the old tracks about 2 years ago. It was a terrible accident. She paused, taking a breath to steady her voice. That bobcat you found, he stayed there, guarding his friend's body for high days in the rain. He never left. We could hear him from town, crying with a sound I'll never forget. He wailed until he lost his voice. Animal control wanted to take him away, but Alara begged them to stop. She told them he was grieving, and that he deserved the time to say goodbye. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. The girl was destroyed. Quinn had been her companion since she was a toddler. After the burial, Alara took that book, the one Quinn used to sleep on, and buried it at the foot of the old oak tree near the tracks. She said it was a gift for the bobcat. She wanted him to have something to hold on to, because that book was the only thing the three of them ever shared. Every evening, she would read it aloud on her porch. Quinn would sit in her lap, and that bobcat, Grin, would sit in the shadows just to listen. Ellis felt a sharp ache in his chest. He thanked Margaret and drove back to his workshop in silence. Inside, Grin was awake. The bobcat had dragged himself into the darkest corner, his wary, haunted eyes tracking Ellis's every move. Ellis sat down at his work table and looked at the animal for a long time. He didn't see a predator anymore. He saw a friend who had spent high years trying to keep a memory alive, clutching a handful of paper and ink because it was all he had left of a life he once loved. His hands trembled as he picked up his tools. He understood now why the bobcat had held that book so desperately. He was not clutching an inanimate object. He was holding on to the last warmth of Quinn, the only tangible piece of his friend left in this entire world. Everything else was gone. Alara had moved away. Quinn was dead. The house where they had all been together was empty. Only this book remained. The old craftsman's tears fell onto the handmade paper as he worked. He carefully cut a small piece of quality paper and wrote on it in his best hand, "Belongs to Grin." Then he pasted it over the library's discarded stamp. This book would never be discarded again. It belonged to Grin. It would always belong to Grin. The days that followed were a symphony of silence. No words were spoken, yet a bridge was slowly being built. Grin remained in the shadows, moving only to eat the food Ellis left or to drink from his bowl. But his eyes never left the old man. They watched, assessed, and waited. Ellis understood the language of the wild. He didn't offer a hand to be sniffed or try to coax the animal with soft words. Instead, he simply let the workshop speak for him. The rhythmic shurr of the paper cutter, the steady thud-thud of the needle through leather, and the soft clink of the paste brush became a steady heartbeat in the room. This predictable, calm labor created a frequency of safety. It was a wordless promise that here, nothing would hurt him. Time didn't move in hours, but in inches. A week drifted by, and the invisible wall began to thin. Grin moved from the far corner to the center of the room, and then to the edge of the workbench. One morning, while Ellis was applying adhesive to a book spine in long, even strokes, the Bobcat finally stepped into the light. He walked with a pronounced limp, his left leg dragging slightly across the floorboards, with a visible effort that made Ellis hold his breath. Grin jumped onto the table. He didn't ask for a touch, but he lay down right next to the stitching machine, settling into the warmth of the workshop and the presence of the man who had saved him. Neither looked at the other. Ellis continued his work as if nothing had changed. His needle moved in and out of the leather binding in a steady rhythm. The Bobcat closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. They shared the space like two wild entities taking shelter from the rain together. No demands, no expectations, just proximity, just the comfort of not being alone. Each day, the distance between them shrank by a few more inches. Ellis never rushed the process. He kept his hands to himself and his eyes on his craft. He worked with a quiet diligence, knowing that the familiar music of the workshop, the tactile sounds of paper and thread, offered Grin a sanctuary. In the steady cadence of the bookbinding, the Bobcat seemed to find a lost thread of his past, the memory of sitting in the cool shadows while Alar's voice rose and fell, and those long, peaceful evenings with Quinn when the world still felt whole. Once the restoration was complete, every page dried, pressed, and returned to its rightful sequence. Ellis turned his attention to the final details. He re-glued the spine with archival adhesive and treated the worn leather cover until it regained its suppleness. That night, he sat down and began to read aloud. He remembered Margaret's story about the porch and the three of them, and he realized that, to Grin, these words were more than just a story. They were the sound of home. If this book had been that important to Quinn and Grin, if it had been the thread connecting them, then it deserved to be read aloud again. Ellis settled into his chair by the fireplace. Grin lay on the floor nearby, not touching, but close. Ellis opened the book and began. There was once a velveteen rabbit, and in the beginning, he was really splendid. As the evenings deepened, Ellis began to notice small ink notes tucked into the margins of the pages. The handwriting was the same earnest, childish script from the title page, forming a quiet diary of a life shared. March 5th, Quinn laughed when we read this. May 7th, read this for the second time. Each note was a heartbeat, a record of a friendship measured in shared chapters. On the very last page, surrounded by a cluster of dates from repeated readings, a final line was written in shaky, slanted letters. October 12th, Quinn is gone, buried the book at the foot of the oak. Every time Ellis read those familiar words aloud, Grin leaned in, his amber eyes would half close, and his ears swiveled toward the sound of Ellis's voice, catching every syllable. To the Bobcat, the murmuring cadence of the story seemed to be a bridge, a thin, golden thread stretching back to Quinn. Grin was never merely a passive listener. His head would tilt at certain passages, and his ears would stand fully erect at familiar phrases. He moved with the precise rhythm of someone who had memorized the music of this story from the shadows, long before he had ever been invited into the light. Ellis decided he needed to know more. He returned to the library and found Margaret reshelving books. "Tell me about the bond between them," he asked. "Between Quinn and Grin. How did a wild bobcat and a house cat become friends?" Margaret set down her books and led Ellis to a chair. She seemed grateful to talk about it, as if the story had been weighing on her. Grin is not an ordinary bobcat, she began. He was an orphan. Years ago, maybe 5 or 6 years back, a massive forest fire in Yosemite pushed wild animals close to residential areas. You remember that fire? Burned for weeks. Grin was just a weak bobcat cub then, having lost his mother in the flames. He began lingering around Alara Vance's garden looking for scraps, looking for anything to survive. She continued, most people would have called animal control immediately. A wild bobcat, even a cub, is dangerous. But Alara was different. She was a child with an open heart. She started leaving small bowls of water and food at the edge of the woods, just setting them out and walking away, giving him space. But it was Quinn, Alara's white cat, who truly tamed Grin. Quinn was a bold little thing, fearless. She walked right up to that bobcat cub one day and touched noses with him through the garden fence. After that, they were inseparable. Quinn would share her food with Grin. She would curl up on her side of the fence, and Grin would curl up on his side, and they would sleep like that for hours. They played together, chased each other, groomed each other through the fence slats. Margaret smiled at the memory. Alara often sat on the porch reading to Quinn every evening. Just a girl and her cat and a book. A routine they had, but one day she noticed something. Grin was always sitting motionless in the shadows of the pine trees at the edge of the property. Just sitting there, listening. He would not come closer, would not show himself fully, but he would not leave either. So Alara started reading louder. She would face toward the forest. She was reading to both of them, to Quinn curled in her lap and to Grin hidden in the shadows. What happened the day Quinn died? Ellis asked. Though part of him dreaded the answer, Margaret's face fell. Quinn was chasing a butterfly, just doing what cats do. She crossed the old railroad tracks, the ones they do not use anymore for regular train, but sometimes for moving timber. A truck was coming down the hill with a load of logs. Something went wrong. The driver lost control or the load shifted. The logs spilled onto the road right where Quinn was. Grin saw it happening. He rushed out from the woods to try to pull Quinn back, but he was too late. Her voice broke. The logs fell on both of them. Quinn was killed instantly. Grin survived, but his leg was crushed. Several ribs broken. He should have died too. Animal control came in and tried to move him to treat his injuries, but he would not leave Quinn's body. He lay there beside her for 2 full days and nights, crying, keening. The sound carried through the whole town. People could not sleep. It was the saddest sound I have ever heard. Margaret wiped her eyes. Finally, Alara convinced animal control to let her handle it. She buried Quinn in her garden. Then she took that book, The Velveteen Rabbit, the one she had read to them every single evening for years, and she buried it at the foot of the old oak tree by the tracks. She told Grin it was for him, that he could have it to remember Quinn. Then she and her parents left town. They could not stay after what happened. She looked at Ellis intently. But here is the thing. After Alara left, after everything was quiet, Grin dug up that book. He dug it up that very night. He did not want it buried in the darkness. He wanted to carry Quinn's warmth with him, and that is what he did. He carried it everywhere, through the forest, through the rain, through everything, until the night he could not go on anymore, until the night he collapsed and you found him. Ellis returned home with a heavy heart, but also a profound sense of purpose. He understood everything now. He understood the depth of Grin's loss, the magnitude of his grief, the reason he had clung to that book even as death approached. The turning point in their new life together came when Noma, the stray calico who had led Ellis to Grin that terrible rainy night, finally stepped fully into the house. She had been hovering at the threshold for weeks, coming inside for meals but always leaving, sleeping on the porch but never staying overnight. Now she walked in with purpose and confidence. She crossed the workshop floor and approached Grin's meat bowl, where Ellis had left fresh venison for the bobcat, without hesitation, without asking permission. Noma took a bite of Grin's food and leisurely walked away. It was a bold move, a statement of equality. She was claiming this space as her own. Grin watched Noma from his spot on the work table. His eyes followed her movements across the workshop floor. He did not growl or hiss. Instead, a flash of something, wonder perhaps or recognition, appeared in his eyes. Noma had a stature and gait very similar to Quinn's. The same confident walk, the same small, compact frame, the same fearlessness in approaching a creature 10 times her size, the same calico markings, though in different patterns. For the first time since arriving at Ellis's workshop weeks ago, Grin relaxed his muscles completely. The constant tension that had been coiled in his shoulders released. His breathing deepened. He approached Noma cautiously, sniffing the air around her. She sat down and calmly began grooming herself, completely unbothered by the massive predator examining her. Then Grin did something remarkable. He tentatively stepped toward the workbench and lay down next to Ellis's hand-stitching machine, not in the corner where he usually retreated, not hidden in shadow. Right there in the open, in the center of the workspace, with Ellis on one side and Noma on the other. Ellis chuckled softly, a sound of pure joy. He never stopped his sewing. His hands continued their rhythmic work. But inside, his heart was soaring. A new order was established in that moment. Noma had taught Grin how to trust again. Or perhaps she had reminded him of what trust felt like, what friendship looked like, what it meant to share space without fear or pain. Noma stayed at Ellis's house after that, never leaving again. Perhaps she had found a friend. Perhaps she had found a purpose. So had Grin. So had Ellis. Every evening, after finishing his work for the day, Ellis would bring out the Velveteen Rabbit and read. But this time, more than one animal listened to him. Grin lay near the base of the chair, his large head resting on his forepaws. Noma curled up in Ellis's lap, her small body warm and purring softly. When Ellis reached the passage, "Real is not how you are made. It is a thing that happens to you. When a child loves you for a long, long time, not just to play with, but really loves you, then you become real." Grin would slightly tilt his head, his eyes would half close. There was no purring from him, no sound at all, but his entire body would go soft. Every muscle would release. This was the signal of profound trust, of peace, of being home. Ellis would stop reading at those moments. His hand would rest lightly on the page. In the silence that followed, he would suddenly realize that all three souls present in that workshop had been healed. The old man who had lost his cat and thought he would spend his remaining years alone. The bobcat who had lost his best friend and wandered the wilderness carrying the weight of grief. The stray calico who had spent years surviving on the margins. All three had found each other. All three had found healing one evening. Ellis decided to rebind the Velveteen Rabbit with his finest materials. The book deserved it. He used high-quality red thread, strong and beautiful, as he sewed the spine, pulling the thread through each signature with careful precision. Noma became fascinated by the movement, her hunting instincts engaged. She pounced at the dangling thread, her paws batting at it playfully. Grin had been dozing on the work table. At Noma's sudden movement, his eyes opened. His head began swaying back and forth, following the rhythm of her play. Ellis could see the internal struggle, the wild instinct warring with the learned caution. Then, unable to suppress the urge any longer, unable to resist the invitation of play, Grin extended one large, broad paw and clumsily tapped Noma's tail. Noma whirled around instantly, for a heartbeat. Ellis held his breath. He was afraid she would run or hiss or lash out. Instead, she lunged directly at Grin, launching herself into a play wrestle. The bobcat, so much larger and so much stronger, was incredibly gentle. He pulled his claws in completely. He moved slowly and carefully. They tumbled across the workbench, knocking over a jar of brushes that clattered to the floor. Noma climbed onto Grin's back, her tiny paws gripping his thick fur. Grin rolled over carefully, letting her win, exposing his belly in complete submission and trust. Noma pounced on his stomach. Grin batted at her gently with his massive paws, never using his claws, never using his strength. They wrestled like siblings, like old friends reunited. Ellis watched the scene and burst out laughing. It was a raspy, dry laugh that startled even him. He could not remember the last time he had laughed like this. The sound seemed foreign in his own throat. In that moment, the final barrier of vigilance collapsed for all of them. The last wall came down. On the workbench, Ellis continued sewing books, his skilled hands creating beauty from broken things. Beneath the table, two cats played together, teaching each other how to trust again. The winter passed, then spring arrived, bringing warmth and new growth to the Yosemite forest. The ice melted from the creek beds, wildflowers pushed up through the soil, birds returned from their southern migrations. Ellis decided it was time. He led Grin and Noma to the old oak tree near the railroad tracks where Quinn was buried and where Alara had first left the book. They walked slowly through the morning. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. Grin's limp was still pronounced. He would always walk with that damaged gait, but he moved with purpose now, with direction. He knew where they were going. When they reached the oak tree, Grin approached the trunk carefully. He sniffed the bark, moving around the circumference. His nose traced patterns only he could understand. Then he stopped at one spot and rubbed his body against it, hard, marking it with his scent. It was a final goodbye, a release, a way of saying, I was here and I remember and I will always love you, but I am ready to move forward now. Ellis stood back, giving Grin all the time he needed. Noma sat beside Ellis, uncharacteristically still. They waited. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Grin turned his head. He looked directly at Ellis. His gaze no longer held the darkness and despair of that stormy night when Ellis had found him dying in the mud. His eyes were clear now, peaceful, present. He looked at the oak tree one last time, one final look toward the past, toward Quinn, toward everything he had lost and would always carry with him. Then he bounded, as much as his damaged leg would allow, toward the two beings he loved now, toward Ellis and Noma, toward his new life. Grin chose to stay, not just because he was a disabled bobcat who would struggle to survive in the wild without a fully functioning leg, not just because Ellis provided food and shelter and warmth. He stayed because this workshop, with its rhythmic sounds of bookbinding and its patient old man and its fearless calico cat, had given him what he thought he would never have again: a home, a family, a purpose, love. The memory of a friend who has gone far away is not an anchor that holds us in the darkness. It is not a weight that drags us down. It is a lighthouse, shining a light for us to recognize where the next place of love is to return to. Ellis understood this now in his bones. Grin had taught him. The book had taught him. Quinn's love for Grin had not ended with her death. It had transformed. It had become the very thing that led Grin to survive long enough to be found. That led Ellis to sit in the freezing rain for 3 hours. That led them both, along with Noma, to this moment of healing. Eventually, Ellis hung a sign outside the bookshop. Simple wooden letters carved by his own hand. Bookbinding and Bobcat. The words were straightforward but effective. Visitors came from neighboring towns and eventually from across the state. They came not just to have their precious books repaired, but to witness something rare and beautiful. To see an old man sitting at his work table stitching the pages of life, beside a massive bobcat and a calico cat sleeping soundly on a pile of leather scraps and cloth remnants. They came to see proof that broken things can be mended. That grief does not have to be the end of the story. That love finds a way to continue, even after death, if we are brave enough to remain open to it. On the final blank page of The Velveteen Rabbit, Ellis wrote in his careful, steady handwriting, Chapter 2, The New Life of Grin, Ellis, and Noma, beginning from that rainy day. And it was true. That rainy night when Noma scratched at the door and led Ellis to a dying bobcat clutching a waterlogged book was not an ending. It was a beginning. The beginning of a new chapter for all three of them. A chapter about healing and trust and the strange, miraculous ways that love persists. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.